Last week, a Russian Su-27 fighter collided with an American MQ-9 Reaper drone operating over the Black Sea, and almost immediately a variety of competing narratives emerged, with some highlighting this as an example of Russian pilot incompetence, but still others citing a broader conspiracy for a Russian technological intelligence windfall. Did a Russian pilot just screw up, or is there something bigger at play here? Let's dive into this. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a special edition of Air Power. So right when this story dropped, I got started on a deep dive into just how well or poorly trained Russian pilots really are as compared to their counterparts in the West. And while I was already generally aware that American pilots tend to have more experience in the cockpit than Russian pilots do, I was still shocked by how poorly trained Russian pilots are, and even more so by the severity of the pilot crisis that Russia is currently facing. Even in the best of times, Russian pilots are sent to their first combat units with less time in the cockpit than American pilots get before they're even assigned their combat aircraft. But the problem goes so much deeper than that, to the point where Russia has even pulled the instructors out of its military flight schools and sent them to the front lines. So in this week's regularly scheduled episode of Air Power that'll premiere on Friday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll start a two-part series into how Russian flight training really works, and just how serious their pilot shortage is. We'll be going over everything from an objective assessment of how Russian flight training compares to the United States to how their pilot shortage has caused them to even send their instructors to the front lines. But because of how research heavy this topic is and how the video won't be out until Friday, I thought it would make sense to release an extra episode this week going over exactly what happened over the Black Sea last Tuesday, along with dispelling some of the common myths and misconceptions that have arisen thanks in no small part to bad actor narratives that are being advanced on social media as we speak. So since I'm rushing this one out the door, please bear with me, on the footage that I end up using. My incredible editor Hector Tinoco is already at work on Friday's episode, so I'm going to be just muddling through this one as quick as I can. Okay, enough preamble, let's get into it. According to the U.S. Defense Department, an unarmed U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper was operating over international waters, flying above the Black Sea in the early morning of March 14th. At right around 7:03 a.m. local time, the drone was intercepted by a pair of Russian Su-27 flankers, who proceeded to harass the American aircraft for the next 30 or so minutes, cutting directly in front of it, attempting to douse it in fuel, and generally flying in what American officials have described as an unsafe and unprofessional manner. But then, just after 7:30, one of the two Su-27s collided with the MQ-9 Reaper, hitting it right on the prop on the rear of the aircraft. In footage released by the Pentagon, you can clearly see the fighter approaching the drone while dumping fuel, followed by a brief cutout in the footage as the two aircraft collide, and then when the feed starts back up again, you can clearly see one of the blades on the MQ-9's propeller has been damaged in the impact. Of course, before this footage had even been released, Russia had already started lying, issuing a statement saying, and I quote, that as a result of sharp maneuver, the U.S. drone went into uncontrollable flight with a loss of altitude and collided with the water's surface. Now, it's important to remember that this is, after all, the same nation that once said they were massing troops on Ukraine's border as a training exercise, and who just a few years ago released footage from an iPhone game claiming it was irrefutable evidence that the US was supporting ISIS in Syria. These claims are obviously ridiculous, and evidence always refutes them, but Russia is well aware of the fact that confirmation bias alone will lead many to take whatever they're told at face value. And you won't have to go far to find evidence of this, you'll find it in the comments below this video as soon as it goes up. It's also important to note that flooding the channel with often contradictory information is an important tenet in Russia's information operations strategy, which they refer to as reflexive control. One of the most pervasive Russian-backed narratives to emerge following this incident is the idea that the US had no right to be operating over the Black Sea in the first place, citing Russia's claims that the region is, quote, off limits. As the Russian ambassador to the United States, Natalie Antonev, told reporters last week, as we see it, American aircraft have no business being near the Russian border. Now, if you're not 100% sure on what the geography around the Black Sea looks like, this seems like a pretty reasonable claim. But all that good reason goes right out the window as soon as you look at a map. You see, the Black Sea is surrounded by 6 nations. 3 of those nations are NATO allies, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, and 2 more are formal NATO partners, Ukraine and Georgia. Of the approximately 3,600 miles of coastline that surround this body of water, Russia has a legal claim to less than 500 miles of it, with the remaining 3,100 or more miles all legally owned by NATO allies or partners. And with Russian forces actively enacting the largest invasion on European soil since World War II against one of those NATO partners, and right next to a group of NATO allies, it would be practically negligent not to have NATO aircraft in the sky monitoring the situation over the Black Sea. Even the Russian border they're referring to is Crimea, which is a peninsula that belongs to Ukraine but was invaded and occupied by Russia back in 2014. In other words, Russia's one of the only nations that considers Crimea their territory. But to be totally honest, the legality surrounding the situation is a bit murky. I dive deeper into this in a full story that'll go up on Sandboxx News, but I'll summarize the legal issues here. While a variety of international accords and treaties that were signed by Russia all recognize the validity of international waters and the right for military aircraft to operate over them, Russia can make the argument that the drone was not a neutral asset, as it may have been providing intel directly to Ukraine. But even that neutrality issue is subject to further debate based on the legal wording within these international accords and treaties. These treaties have special allowances for instances where one nation is the clear aggressor against another. And seeing as last week also saw the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over war crimes, I think it's safe to say that, yeah, Russia's the clear aggressor here. But there's still a lot more to consider. Even the intent of the Russian pilot is subject to legal standing, because the difference in how you would classify harassing an aircraft and crashing into one, legally speaking, really comes down to whether or not the pilot meant to do it. In other words, despite this seeming like a pretty straightforward situation, this could be legally debated for years. But I will point out that independent expert analysts like Professor of International Law at the University of Reading in the UK, Michael Schmidt, say that despite the complexity, the US does have the basis for a winning legal argument. I'll quote Professor Schmidt here. Based on those appearing in open sources, the Russian operation almost certainly violated the international law obligation of due regard, and, perhaps, the prohibition on using force. And there would appear to be no definitive legal justification for its action. It would follow that the United States is entitled to reparations for its loss of the Reaper, and enjoys the right to take countermeasures to secure them. For practical reasons, however, this is an unlikely scenario. Schmidt goes on to point out that if America attempted to use this incident as legal justification to pursue reparations, Russia would invariably refuse. And at that point, the US would find itself in a difficult position. It could attempt to force restitution or retaliate with a bit of what I like to call kinetic diplomacy, both of which threaten to escalate the war in Ukraine to a broader regional conflict that could see US troops directly involved in the fighting. Conversely, the US can use this incident as further justification for broadening support for Ukraine, which does very little to threaten the security of NATO allies on the continent, all while continuing to allow for the decimation of vast portions of Russia's conventional military forces with relatively little risk to the US. And with a great deal more to gain than the US has to potentially lose, that seems like the logical course of action. But now let's get back to intent. To be clear, this question of intent says a great deal about Russia's perception of American military power, as well as its regard for international law. If the Russian pilot had been ordered to collide with the American drone to bring it down, it would mean that the Russian military sees the presence of these unmanned aircraft as a serious threat to the forces in the region. But importantly, one they don't want to engage with directly. These fighters carry 30mm cannons on board and have a variety of air-to-air missiles at their disposal. The only reason a pilot might be ordered to take down an American drone without firing on it would be for the benefit of plausible deniability. In other words, making it look like an accident so as to avoid any American military reprisal. Any argument citing saved ammunition or anything to that effect completely ignores the high likelihood that an aircraft and its pilot can both be lost when colliding with a drone the size of an A-10 Warthog. Because despite what you might hear from Russian supporters all over social media, there's nothing crafty or frugal about crashing your $37 million fighter with a trained pilot on board into a drone that's not actively participating in the conflict you're in. And seeing as Russia is suffering from a severe shortage in experienced aviators, that pilot was likely even more valuable than the expensive aircraft. According to one RUSI analysis published last summer, Russia may have entered this conflict with only 100 fully trained and qualified fighter pilots, accompanied by a bevy of far less experienced aviators. And since then, things have only gotten worse, meaning the pilot at the stick of the Su-27 that crashed into the MQ-9 was either one of Russia's very few well-trained and experienced pilots, or more likely was one of the far greater number of poorly trained and not very experienced pilots that Russia has rushed into the fight. The fact of the matter is, trying to frame what was very likely an accident made by a poorly trained and inexperienced pilot as a bit of precision flying worthy of a state-sanctioned medal is the very definition of putting lipstick on a pig. But, and there is an important but here, just because it seems evident the Russian fighter didn't mean to collide with the American drone doesn't mean these fighters weren't trying to take the drone down. In another video Turkey released later in the week, you can very clearly see Russian Su-27s attempting to down a Bayraktar TB2 drone operated by Ukraine using their jet wash. Now this one's a bit interesting because this was a Ukrainian-operated drone, which means Russia would have been well within their rights to use onboard weapons to take this drone down. It was a hostile aircraft, but they didn't. Now, a number of theories have been posited as to why, from these Russian fighters not being armed with any air-to-air missiles, to the possibility that the pilot himself was unsure about the drone's nation of origin. And while these are certainly plausible explanations, I think that something else is at play here. These Bayraktar TB2s are not armed with air-to-air weapons, and as such pose no threat to these Russian fighters, giving them ample opportunity to experiment in finding ways to take down a drone without engaging it kinetically, allowing for that plausible deniability that they would need the next time they ran across an American or other NATO drone that they might want to take down without picking a fight with the NATO alliance. And further, that would explain Russia's immediate response to accusations about taking down this drone, saying that it was a result of sharp maneuver that the drone went into uncontrolled flight, because if things had gone according to plan, it would have been a combination of the fighter's jet wash and dumping fuel into the MQ-9's engine intake that would have caused it to sputter and spiral into the sea. And yeah, that might seem crazy knowing full well that American drones have cameras on board, but I'd like to point out how many people not only bought Russia's take, but are fervently advancing this narrative despite the video evidence to the contrary. Again, I'm all but certain you'll find them in the comments below this very video. But before we close out, I also want to address concerns about what if Russia recovers this drone from the Black Sea. Now, we know for a fact that Russia is already working to recover this wreckage. Last Thursday, the war zone identified a report from the Crimea-centric pro-Russian news site 4Post, claiming that the Russian Navy had located the wreckage of the Reaper in waters near the Crimean Peninsula. According to this report, the wreckage was at a depth of some 2,952 feet, and according to an unnamed source, an underwater robot descended to investigate. Not long after, CNN reported that US officials believe Russia has successfully recovered small fragments that they described as small bits of fiberglass from this drone wreckage. And while there are always valid concerns about foreign, especially enemy nations, recovering your military technology, recovering this drone would likely offer Russia more of a propaganda victory than a technological one. As Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said, steps were taken to limit the value of any recovery, likely suggesting some sort of automated destruct of data or hardware on board. The reported recovery of just small fragments of the drone in these deep waters seems to substantiate that lack of serious concern out of American defense officials. In fact, one quote from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark A. Milley, sums it up pretty well. There's probably not a lot to recover, frankly. As far as the loss of anything sensitive, intelligence, etc., as normal, we would take and did take mitigating measures. So we're quite confident that whatever was of value is no longer of value. Add to that the fact that the Reaper is a 2-decade-plus old system, and Russia has very likely already gotten their hands on wreckage from MQ-9s that went down over places like Syria, and recovering bits of this MQ-9 start to seem like a bit of a nothing burger. Of course, that's not to say that Russia won't pretend that it was a massive intelligence victory, and that's just in keeping with their narrative efforts. But in summary, when I'm asked whether or not I think this Russian fighter pilot crashed into this American drone on purpose, I'm reminded of Hanlon's razor. Never ascribe to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence. And on that ends this special edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.